Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to all our attendees and our panelists to the Shireen Abu Akla, A New Path to Peace Conference, panel number 2. On our second panel, we would be discussing what would the one state look like and how would it function. With us, we have assembled an esteemed panel of scholars and activists, and our moderator for this panel will be Lara Elborno, a Palestinian American international lawyer and activist based in Paris, France. Her family originally hails from Gaza and Jaffa. She is the co-host to a weekly English language podcast called the Palestine Pod, which aims to support the Palestinian struggle for justice and liberation. You can follow her on Instagram at Gazangirl or Twitter at TheGazangirl. And without any further ado, I turn it over to Lara.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's my pleasure to be moderating this panel today, the title of which, of course, is What Would the One-State Solution Look Like and How Would It Function? So our speakers today will be Jeff Halper, Conor McCarthy, Awad Abdelfattah, and Jonathan Kuttab. Each panelist will address the topic for about 15 minutes. Then we will go into a Q&A and discussion. To the audience, you've joined enough webinars by now to know about the Q&A function. So if you have a question, drop it in the question and answer box, and we will try to get through as many questions as we can. Let's get started with Jonathan first. He's a human rights attorney, a member of the Bar of New York, Israel and Palestine, and executive director of Friends of Sabeel North America. His remarks will address a vision for a hybrid state that provides the minimum requirements for Palestinian Arabs as well as Israeli Jews, in a state that constitutionally guarantees the rights of both communities, but does not provide either of them with exclusivity or domination over the other, regardless of demographic changes in the future, whether resulting from the right of return or from natural birth rates. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think that's a very succinct summary of my little book, Beyond the Two-State Solution, which I urge many of you to download. You can download it for free and read it, or at least read the summary at the end. Basically, the approach that I took is a non-ideological approach. I did not spend a lot of time on settler colonialism or apartheid or the human rights violation or international law. I simply said that these two movements, these two ideologies have failed. Palestinian Arab nationalism, the idea that Palestine Arabiya can no longer work because half the people living in historic Palestine today are not Arab, and they're going nowhere, apart from the fact that you don't have the power to impose anything, but they're there and they're not going anywhere. But by the same token, Zionism has failed. The idea that they wanted to have a state that's as Jewish as France is French, with every possible advantage, military, technological, financial support of the United States, a vibrant arms industry, nuclear weapons, total control over the area. They have failed. Half of the people living today in Eretz Israel are not Jews, and they're going nowhere. So what do we do? What does that leave us with? I think everybody will say, that that leaves us either with apartheid or some form of a one-state solution. Now, the approach that I took was a little bit different. I said, what is it that Zionism promises to Israeli Jews? And what is it that Palestinian nationalism promises to Palestinian Arabs. And maybe we can provide them with their minimum requirements and needs within a single unitary state, except for exclusivity. You can have a state that's Jewish, but that's also Arab. And you can have Palestine Arabiya, but it's also Jewish. Well, how do you do that? So I spent some time thinking about that and thinking about what are the objections that may arise before such a resolution, and what are the fears, what are the existential worries of both communities. And I think we can meet them and we can address them. What we cannot do is give everybody exclusivity, give everybody the luxury of denying, ignoring, demonizing, disenfranchising, or ethnically cleansing the other side. It simply is not going to happen. We have to live together. Now, right after 67, some people thought that the two-state solution provides such a pragmatic arrangement, however unfair it was. But what has happened over the last 50 years is that the Zionist side has systematically undermined any possibility of a Palestinian state in the occupied territories, have acted as total sovereign, have moved their people, about 700,000, into the occupied territories, have created for them an elaborate infrastructure of roads, of courts, of laws, of institutions. They even have a university that allows them to stay in that occupied territory as full sovereign without taking on the obligations or the duties or the responsibility of a sovereign country. While keeping this mirage of, oh, just you wait a little bit, there's going to be two states, there's going to be a Palestinian state once the Palestinians get their act together, once there's a more moderate Israeli leadership, once there's a little bit more pressure from the international community, it's going to happen. Just wait. Now I think everybody realizes it's not going to happen. This is a permanent state of affairs that requires new thinking out of the box, where we cannot anymore accept the old paradigm, where we have to admit to ourselves, to our own people, and to everybody else that we have failed. Zionism has failed. Palestinian nationalism has failed. We need to find a new situation that addresses both sides and their needs. Now, there are some very clear objections. The first one is the demographic demon. What happens when the other side becomes 51% majority? They'll do to us what we did to them until now. So we have to address that particular fear by pointing out that in a genuine democracy, it's not 51% that determines everything, and you cannot ignore substantial minorities. There must be guarantees for all stakeholders, particularly large minorities. So there has to be structural changes that safeguard and guarantee the rights of both communities, as well as the rights of the individual, by the way, from the total oppressiveness of 51% majority taking control of the parliament and putting whatever laws they want at the expense of the other group. We have to address security needs, and I spent some time dealing with that particular issue. Not because I don't think that Palestinians need security. We need it just as much, if not more, than Israeli Jews. But there is a history there, from anti-Semitism for millennia, through the Holocaust, through continued hostility since the Zionist project started in Palestine. So people are worried, they're afraid, and they have security concerns. I try to address those by some creative thinking. One of the things that I suggest is that the head of the Ministry of Defense, Army, Navy, Air Force, and nuclear thing will always be an Israeli Jew with an Arab deputy, but the head of the police, internal security, will always be a Palestinian Arab with a Jewish deputy. That there will be some structures, constitutional structures, court structures that guarantee the rights of each group regardless of who has the majority. I address the right of return for both Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews who want the right of return. I address the reality that many Jews are actually living in homes that belong to Arabs or on land that they took from Arabs. I address that in a way that is not absolute justice, but relative justice, so that we don't kick people out of the homes that they are living in, but you will provide alternative housing and alternative land from public lands that are available, as well as compensation to those who lost their lands and their homes. In a way, it's a pragmatic solution. It's an attempt to deal with the reality that people have to live with and that people have to live under. It is not an absolutely wonderful, perfect solution. And there are still many problems in arriving at it, because you still have to deal with the imbalance of power between the two parties. The fact that those who are in power and those who are privileged are usually not the most eager to give up their privileges. The minute you talk about equality to anybody who's privileged, it sounds like you're oppressing them, because you're taking away their privileges, their rights. The slave owners thought that you're taking away their property when you talk about giving equality to their slaves. You're taking away their property. Yes, there is going to be sacrifices on both sides, and it's going to be a struggle, but I think it is possible. I think we need to think out of the box, and we need to abandon all this talk about a two-state solution that has become an excuse, an alibi for continuing the status quo. And we need to stop talking about Israel's need for security, because that's become an alibi and an excuse for more and more reliance on weapons and on military might, rather than seeking other ways to address the problems and other resolutions to arrive at something that's doable. Another idea that I had to deal with Israel's security needs is 10% of the budget of the Defense Department has to go to a special department that is dedicated to removing the causes of conflict and the causes of bitterness and the causes of misunderstanding. So you teach each group the history, language, and culture of the other group. You work on joint projects. You address their heartfelt bitterness and their heartfelt concerns, because that's the way you prevent them from turning to violence. I always say that the biggest danger to Israel doesn't come from Iran or Turkey or missiles or anything else. It comes from an ordinary Palestinian schoolgirl, 12 years old, who has a pair of sharp scissors in her pocket that she wants to stick into somebody, and she doesn't care whether that helps or doesn't help Palestine or her cause or her people. So we have to address the really heartfelt needs of both sides in order to achieve security. I will stop here to try and be conscious of the needs, and I'm looking actually for comments and for critiques. Tell me that what I'm saying doesn't make sense or is not possible, or that I have not addressed these issues, so that we can address them. I don't claim that I have found the Holy Grail. What I do claim is that we really need to think out of the box, that what we've tried so far doesn't work and hasn't worked. and that we must look for new ways to think about these things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. You have 4 minutes to go if you still want to
Oh,
keep going.
I have plenty.
You let me know because you didn't go over. So any last points you want to make?
Yeah, I think I want to end with what I've ended with, which is sometimes it's hard to think out of the box. People are caught up in whatever paradigm they are caught up in. They are full of anger, they are full of resentment, they are full of justifiable desire to do something. And it's amazing that the Palestinians have not been as violent as they have been. It's amazing that Palestinians have been, in the words of Afif Safi, unreasonably reasonable in their attempts to arrive at a resolution. But I happen to be a pacifist, so it's not a big concession on my part. But I happen to believe that violence does not help us as Palestinians. It's counterproductive. It feeds into what I call the Holocaust syndrome, the phobias of the other side, even though we have every right to resist and to use weapons to resist and to fight for our freedom. It's not very wise for us to do it. And somehow we must also manage to communicate to the other side that weapons and more weapons and huge, overwhelming power and deterrence is somehow going to give them security, because it is not. It only increases the bitterness, and it only ensures that the other side is also going to be violent and bitter.
Thank you for that. So now we'll turn to Awad Abdelfattah. He's the former head of a Palestinian political party in Israel and a political writer. He hails from Kuttab village, and he's currently the coordinator of the One Democratic State campaign in Mandatory Palestine. He's going to address the need for greater grassroots support for the one-state solution, including the uniqueness of the experience of the Palestinians within 48 and their role in laying the groundwork for a state for all its citizens, as well as the potential that exists for the creation of a democratic state free of colonialism and apartheid. Awad, the floor is yours. You'll have to unmute.
Is Awad with us?
Yes, I see him, but you're on mute.
It's okay. Okay, thanks Lara, thank Jonathan and all the panelists, and good afternoon to the attendees. And thanks for those who organized this important conference. I am honored to be a speaker alongside well-known and distinguished scholars, intellectuals, and activists who have devoted much time to contemplating how to build a bridge to a better present and the future for the family of humanity, including my people, the Palestinian people. At the current moment, we need scholars to use the academic knowledge to develop a final and widely acceptable formula for a political entity within which the Palestinians can live peacefully alongside Israeli Jews on the ruins of the huge injustice that has been and still being inflicted on our people. I am not a scholar, but a political activist. I have been an activist for 42 years, since my early youth in my first year of studies at an Israeli university. Like most of my fellow Palestinians, however, I was born into the heart of politics, or more accurately, under the yoke of colonization, deprivation, and security. And so my daily encounters with the colonizers have taken two main forms, one of which is the experience of being a Palestinian who routinely experiences discrimination, Jewish supremacy, and a sense of inferiority and estrangement in the self-declared Jewish state. The second is the experience of being an activist who has to endure political persecution, arrests, beatings, and repeated firings from workplaces, not only of yourself, but also of family members, with all the accompanying pain, frequent losses of hope, and the bitter sense of humiliation. Finding oneself in such a situation, while in the early stages of one's political awareness and self-discovery, one faces a great deal of uncertainty about how to deal with the daily grievances to which yourself, your family, and your people are subjected. Initially, and from an emotional perspective, you would love simply to wake up to a new reality in which every Israeli colonizer has disappeared from the vicinity of your town, from the space in which your family has been living for a very long time prior to the foreign invasion and takeover of your country. Over the years, however, through extensive reading and closer encounters with the anti-Zionist Jewish Israeli activists, one's political experience expands, and one's worldview, one's views about humanity and justice mature, as the difference between Zionism and Jews becomes clearer. Your pain is no longer converted into a despair for revenge, but rather into resilience and a determination to struggle for justice for all, both in Palestine and for all oppressed peoples around the world. My first practice of this humanist approach to the colonial struggle in Palestine came via my decision in the 1980s to join a nationalist progressive movement advocating for a secular democratic state in historic Palestine. The movement was established in 1972 by a group of Palestinians who are citizens of Israel and who drew on the original political platform of the PLO. As you all know, the PLO's call for an egalitarian state was regrettably replaced in 1982 by an unfair and racist partition plan, followed by the Oslo Accords, which transpired to be catastrophic for the Palestinian cause and for the wider cause of justice. As a result, the refugees and the Palestinian citizens of Israel who managed to survive the ethnic cleansing carried out by the Zionist armed militia have been denied the right to self-determination. In response to Oslo, we built a new secular political party called At-Tajammu, which began as a broad coalition of all who opposed Oslo. That is, as an exercise in opposing our exclusion from both the conflict and the solution. Our main goal was to affirm our belonging to the Palestinian people, our civil and national rights, and our right to full equality with Jewish citizens. The party's platform called for a state of all its citizens, along with Israel's withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and the return of the refugees. These three main calls would later become the tenets of the Palestinian BDS movement. However, the party and its political democratic program gained unexpected traction among Palestinian citizens of Israel and transformed into mainstream discourse. The Israeli apartheid state began to systematically persecute the party, accusing its leaders of attempting to subvert the state of Israel from within by denying its exclusive Jewish character. Indeed, the party has been substantially weakened, and yet its political and intellectual legacy continues to inform and inspire new initiatives for a democratic future by both Palestinians and Israelis. As Israel and its elites have closed off all possibilities of discourse regarding the reinvention of Israel as a democratic state in the form of a modern democracy, some of us, including myself, have reopened the debate concerning the one-state solution. Over the last 4 years, we, a relatively large group of Palestinians and the progressive Israeli Jews, have launched a campaign from the city of Haifa to promote the one-state solution, which we named the One Democratic State Campaign, or the ODSC. Why am I opening my contribution by recounting my own personal political experiences? Because some Palestinian intellectuals in the diaspora, and as well as anti-Zionist Israeli intellectuals, believe that Palestinians and Israel are best placed to either lead the one-state project or at least to play a central role in it. I have long been of the opinion that Palestinians and Israel have a crucial role to play in advancing the concept of the single state. It is therefore necessary for all those interested in this noble idea to get a firm sense of the complexities of the lives of this section of the Palestinian people, so that they can engage more effectively in the debate about their contribution to the democratic struggle. The massive literature that has been produced over the last 2 decades on the subject of the one-state solution by Palestinian political scholars and intellectuals, mainly Palestinians in the diaspora, has been of a great significance in terms of defining the pre-existing political orthodoxy and the prevailing state of political paralysis, and also in terms of reclaiming the fundamental tenets of the struggle for liberation from an apartheid settler colonial regime. We in the One Democratic State campaign, for example, have followed much of this literature with a great interest, and it has been a source of inspiration in our endeavor to further the one-state solution, especially among the new generation of political activists. While we believe in the need to maintain our involvement in these intellectual efforts to reach an agreed-upon formula for the political and constitutional shape of the future single state in Palestine, we in the ODSC see our own principal mandate as devising a new political strategy that can unify the different Palestinian constituencies. We view the one-state solution as a vision for restructuring the Palestinian National Liberation Project, uniting the Palestinian people and proposing a modern political entity. This entity should be egalitarian, democratic, and inclusive, and able to protect the individual and cultural rights of all those who currently live in Palestine, in addition to the Palestinian refugees who were expelled by the Zionist organization in 1948. Furthermore, we do not see the one-state solution as something that could be put on the negotiating table with the Israeli apartheid regime. Rather, besides being a vision for coexistence based on justice, we view it as a project of co-resistance, encompassing civil, popular, cultural, and political resistance that includes anti-colonial Israelis. We, as an initiative that is working towards becoming a grassroots movement, have been watching closely and also getting directly involved in what is taking place on the ground in recent years, namely the vast mobilization of the entire Palestinian people against the Israeli project of colonization and its atrocities. The measure of unity we are witnessing has not been seen since the subjugation of the Second Intifada. The uprising of last May 2021, which swept through all of Palestine, and the subsequent political mobilization, as well as the remarkable rallying of Palestinians around the iconic journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, who was assassinated by the Israeli army last week, have demonstrated without any doubt that Palestine, as a geographic and demographic entity, is being reclaimed as such in the consciousness of the Palestinian people, especially among the younger generation. Given that Israel has physically and formally, via the Jewish nation-state law, converted all of Palestine into an exclusive homeland for the Jews, the biggest Jewish ghetto in history, there remains no alternative to an ongoing struggle to decolonize Palestine. The greatest challenge facing the leaders, activists, and intellectuals of the Palestinian people is to work out how to capitalize on this rebirth of grassroots mobilization and the renewed will to fight for liberation and justice. How we can work together and unite our ranks. To this end, we in the ODC have to date largely avoided engaging in the debate over which form we want the state to take, be it binational, unitary, or another form. Myself endorse the unitary state. However, we all agree, as Palestinians and our Jewish allies, that what is crucial right now is the struggle against political orthodoxy and the provision of an alternative vision that is based on equality and inclusion. Of course, none of this is to underestimate the significance of the debate about the various potential forms of the future state. On the contrary, I am certain that this conference will make a major contribution to our common endeavor in this respect and will raise important questions and ideas. I wish the conference much success. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to turn to Jeff Halper. He's an Israeli anthropologist, the director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, and a founding member of the One Democratic State campaign. Jeff is the author of War Against the People, Israel, the Palestinians, and Global Pacification, and his latest book, Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, Zionism, Settler Colonialism, and the Case for One Democratic State. Jeff participated in the Free Gaza movement's effort to break the Israeli siege by sailing into Gaza. His talk will envisage Palestine-Israel as an inclusive democratic state offering equal rights to all of its citizens, bringing the Palestinian refugees back home, providing space for national, ethnic, religious, and political identities within the framework of the state, and eventually giving rise to a new shared political community in a democratic region. Jeff, take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Lara. And I want to join Jonathan and Awad by saying, I think this is a very important conference. It's actually, after all these years, one of the first conferences that's actually dealt with a political solution. We've had a million conferences on all kinds of issues. I'm the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. So house demolitions, of course, and the wall and the violence and Al-Aqsa and taking the land, every issue. And I think in some ways, the Palestine issue has almost been over-researched from the point of view, if you come to East Jerusalem and go to the educational bookshop, which is a wonderful place, from the floor to the ceiling, it's filled with books on Palestine, films. I mean, there's thousands of articles and journals. But at the same time, we, and I say we from the point of view of, I view myself as a comrade to the Palestinians, supporting their liberation struggle, but at the same time, as Jonathan and Awad have said, being part of the struggle for a single state that's going to include everyone that lives in this country and the refugees. So that there's been all this discussion, but we haven't moved towards a political solution. And I think a political program. And I think, it's a truism. You cannot be in a political struggle without a political program. You can have BDS and you can do lobbying and you can do campaigning and you can write articles and books and everything else. But if you don't have a political program to advocate for and mobilize around, you're not in the game. And that's been, I think, our fatal weakness, and certainly the fatal weakness of the Palestinians for many years now. And I'm part of the One Democratic State campaign that Awad is the chair of. Jonathan is involved with us as well, and our thinkings, aren't identical because there's no consensus, as Awad has said, within our group on every detail. But I think what's important, what our group is doing, that's important, is we really are trying to articulate what would go into a political program. What are, and at least to block out some of the major issues that have to be discussed, that have to be settled on, first of all, by the Palestinians, and then I think in conversation with critical Israelis to really, in other words, the more we can present a detailed political plan, the more real it is to people. The idea of one state has been in the air for forever, but it's always been vague. And even, I have to say, the declarations that have come out over the last few years, there's the London Declaration, a Munich Declaration, there's been declarations in Istanbul and so on, and we're all in contact with each other. We're not working against each other, but they've all been very general kinds of declarations. And I think the more we can succeed together in terms of really defining in detail what a political program is, what goes into it, and as you've said at the beginning of this conference, to really give people an idea of what a future, a just and egalitarian and inclusive future would look like How would it actually work? That gives substance to the idea. And then people can say, well, this isn't just a utopian idea. This is actually something I can get my hands on, and it's something we can advocate for. And that's why I think this conference is important. And I think the work of the One Democratic State campaign and Jonathan's work as well in parallel is all important. Having said that, then, you know, I mean, Awad said that, you know, they welcome academic input as well as political activism. So I took that as an invitation. And I think the analysis is very important, because a political program is not simply sitting down and saying, okay, let's put pieces together. What kind of government do we want? Well, boom, let's have that. What kind of a land regime do you want? Okay, the here. Now, how about the, you know, and think of the good ideas. It doesn't work that way. A political plan has to come out of an analysis, because the analysis is what the problem is. What is the problem? And unless you define the problem, you can't get to the solution. Flows from the problem. It isn't a separate kind of an entity. The problem is Zionist settler colonialism. Now, this is something that's been said a lot, especially over the last 4, 5, 6 years. It's become a mantra almost. But people, I don't think, have really gotten into the logic of it. Why that's, it's not just an accusation. It's a description of a political situation, a political process over the last 140 years that dictates what kind of a conclusion you can come out with. And the point, just in a word of settler colonialism, is that Zionism has always, from the very beginning and very upfront, intended and has already done it to Judaize Palestine, to transform an Arab country into a Jewish country. And that remains the purpose of it, so that anybody that thinks a two-state solution is possible, or that Zionism can somehow come to grips with Palestinian, not only nationalism, but Palestinian existence, is simply deluding themselves. The point of Zionism has always been consistent, and that is to take over Palestine and turn it into Israel. So that we have to understand that. Now, as Jonathan said very, very appropriately, you know, what the Palestinians have to take into account is that the Israelis are going to stay. This is a form, you know, there's different forms of settler colonialism. You have settler colonialism like in the United States, in which the indigenous population has become so marginalized and so small and so powerless, the Native Americans, that they have no chance of overthrowing the American settler colonial regime. And so they're working very much to carve out a cultural and political space for themselves within that regime. You have others like Algeria, in which, in fact, the settlers left. They were forced to leave, and that, you know, settled that definitively. We're in a kind of settler colonialism here that I think is most similar to that of South Africa. And that is, in a way, you know, a two-stage liberation movement. If you think about the Black Africans of South Africa, on the one hand, you've got the Palestinian liberation struggle. That hasn't changed from the days of the PLO. And that is that the Palestinians have to be the ones to decide, what does liberation mean for us? How can we restore our sovereignty? If not completely political, then certainly cultural sovereignty. Bringing the refugees home, certainly. Having control of the resources of the country, having access to everything in the country, having our complete political rights, collective as well as individual rights, and whatever you can go. There's a whole. The Palestinians have to decide that, and that has to be the basis of any political plan. And in that's the Palestinian struggle. Like I said, as a comrade, I'll support it in any way I can. I'll support the Palestinians, but this is a Palestinian struggle. I have no role in it, defining for the Palestinians what their liberation vision and needs are. But that's only the first stage, because then, as Jonathan says, Palestinian liberation simply has to take into account, like Black African liberation did in South Africa, the fact that the settler population is going to stay. So the second stage of the struggle for liberation is how do we then create a political arrangement, a political settlement that gives the Palestinians the sovereignty and the liberation in the sense that they need, but within the framework of a state in which they have to live with Israelis. And that state then, of course, and that's where we come in, critical Israelis, anti-Zionist Israelis, as true comrades, because this second part of the struggle is a joint struggle. Here it's a joint struggle, and I think here Palestinians and Israelis have to work together in order to decolonize Zionism, and then work to create a kind of a state in which Palestinian needs are addressed, but then at the same time expanded out to include Israelis. Now, you know, I won't get into detail, there's not much time, but I mean, Israelis are not going to be a partner in this. And that is something we have to understand. This isn't a matter of dialogue. I think Jonathan, Awad, we're right about that. There's no dialogue possible with settlers. The settler colonial movement doesn't want a dialogue with Palestinians. They're the indigenous, they're irrelevant to the Zionists. And that was very much the same in South Africa. So the strategy has to be, our strategy, like that of the ANC, is how do we bypass the Israeli public? How do we bypass the government in order to go to our true ally, our only ally, and that is you guys, the international civil society, the international grassroots, and mobilize them. So in a sense, then, I think the big difference between our approach, that as Awad says, at least my approach and his approach, we can't speak for everybody in the One Democratic State campaign, is for a unitary state. In other words, I think where I would begin to part with Jonathan to some degree is that, yes, it's true there are two national groups in this country. We can't ignore that. But at the same time, unless you want a binational state, that I don't think would work, and I think it doesn't decolonize. It in fact legitimizes and even strengthens the Israeli regime. You've got to have a political, this is, I think, is the essence of what we're saying. You have to have a state that has a civil sovereignty. There has to be a civic space, a neutral space, a kind of a third space of sovereignty that transcends the nationalism both of Palestinians that's going to remain and of Israeli Jews that's going to remain. In other words, there has to be a state with a civil space that would then allow what we would call, and actually there's a very important academic, Mahmoud Mamdani, who teaches at Columbia, who's just written a book called Neither Settler Nor Native, and he relates to the Palestinian issue, in which he says, you know, if you just have two national groups that are hostile to each other with a history of conflict, and both want, every national group wants complete sovereignty. They can't compromise on the idea of sovereignty. Israeli Jews want the land of Israel. Palestinians want, you know, and this was the original idea of the PLO, total liberation of Palestine. So if this is going to work, what you have to try to do is create a civic space, a civic kind of authority of the democratic state that's able to contain, not squelch, because those national expressions are important, but to contain them so that you have national expressions. You know, Palestinians and Israeli Jews are not going away as national groups, but if the national identity prevails, if that's all there is, these two national groups, there's no way they're going to get together. And that, Mamdani warns, has been the experience of newly liberated colonial states. And that is, if anything, you have intercommunal conflicts. Almost every state, after they get independence, after colonialism, falls into terrible civil wars and dictatorships, what he calls the colonial reversal, and almost never get out of it. South Africa avoided that with the transition. How did they avoid it? And I think this is the model we have to follow, because they created a unitary state of equal rights for all its citizens, right? They created civil institutions. They created, and their slogan was, we can hear Mandela say it, we are all South Africans. So there was an idea of a South Africa that included everyone. They called it a non-racial, civic, post-apartheid South Africa that then transcended the different kinds of nationalisms. You know, you had the Pan-Africanist Congress of Steve Biko and Winnie Mandela that wanted a Black African state. They didn't want a unitary state. You had Zulu nationalists, you had Afrikaner nationalists. If they hadn't have created a civil state that had an authority over these nationalist kinds of groups, they would have fallen again into the same sorts of intercommunal struggle that they had before apartheid. And I think that's really what we have to provide in our plan. And therefore, how much time do I have? I lost. I don't want to go over time.
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, good. So I can. So I think that's really important. And then you know, in terms of the details, I think a significant achievement that we've made is we've come up with a 10-point political program. Now, this isn't the political program. So, in other words, it's just an outline. It's a beginning of a process of thinking. But I think a group of Palestinians and anti-Zionist Israeli Jews sitting together for a number of years, we've really formulated what a solid basis of a political program that very much agrees with Jonathan. And Jonathan's plan fits into this very, very well, except I think, again, the difference between us, I think, is that, again, you know, Jonathan is putting more emphasis on the two nation states and somehow them coexisting or finding ways to live together, whereas we're saying there are two national groups, but they have to be subordinated to a wider civic authority. We don't have to get into that right now, but just the essential elements, I think, in our program are, of course, like a unitary state. I mean, this certainly comes out of our program, and that is the idea of constitutional democracy, one citizenship, one legal system, one parliament, one person, one vote, equal citizenship in every sense, not binational, not federation, not, you know, absolute unitary democracy. Secondly, of course, the right of return of all refugees and their descendants. And here there's a logic in the unitary state. Refugees have a right to return. We always talk about the right of return, right of return. Well, of course they have the right of return, but there's something even more basic than that. They are our citizens. In other words, they've never lost their civil status, their civil identity in Palestine. You know, just because you flee your home during a war, or if you're driven out of your home during a war, doesn't mean that you lose your civil status. So they have never stopped being citizens of this country. I think that's one of the important points of our program. So that their coming home is not simply a gesture of international law. This is an incoming of our people to their country that they've never lost any rights to. And so the right of return makes a lot of sense. In other words, we're replacing the Israeli apartheid system that's based on all these kinds of separations with the idea of equal citizenship. And citizenship has its logic, and in that logic, refugees have to return. That's the whole basis of the idea of an incoming of all our citizens. Third, I think again, we recognize that there are collective groups here. There are Palestinian Arabs, there's Israeli Jews, national, and there's other peoples here as well. You know, there's Russians that aren't Jewish, there's 30,000 African asylum seekers that could well stay and become a major community. There's other groups, and you know, it isn't only Israeli Jews and Palestinians. So the idea is that everyone has a right to their collective identity, the national identity, ethnic identities, religious identities, whatever they are, and they have to find ways to being expressed, but within the framework of a democratic state. I think that's important, and that gets into that whole civic versus nationalist kind of attention that we're going to have to deal with. Third, and I'll finish. I have just two quick things. Fourth is I don't know, fourth or whatever it is, the idea of a political community. In other words, of course, what comes out of this idea is you have one state, one polity, but then you also have one shared civil society of equal citizens. We all live together, we all go to school together, we all work together, we share the entire country together. There's no separations. But hopefully, and this I think is the big hopeful part of our plan, is that there's another stage of development. And I think this is where the young people come in, because a civil society is a technical kind of a thing. Okay, you have a civil society, people living together, and there's laws and civic institutions, and okay. But the whole idea of a new us, a new civic national identity emerging, again, transcending the Palestinian and Israeli national identities, a new political community. This is a term that Mamdani uses that I think is very important. A new political community, and I'll give you one little tiny example. Palestine, the Palestinian football team, or in the United States they call it soccer, but the football team in Palestine has a higher ranking in the international federation than the Israeli national football team. But neither have gotten into the World Cup. The World Cup is the Super Bowl 1,000 times bigger. I mean, you know, it's a worldwide Super Bowl basically, and it has tremendous meaning for groups, for countries competing, political as well as cultural as well as sports. So imagine in this new state of ours, and we're still getting used to each other, and there's still tensions, and there's our combined national football team of whatever the country is going to be called. We don't have a name for it yet because we don't have, you know, we're all South Africans. We can't say we're all anything yet. But our national team, what if it gets into the World Cup, into the Mondial? Now it's our team. There's a new our. The our isn't Palestinian, it isn't Israeli, it's something beyond that, transcending that, a new our. That's an example of a new political community beginning to emerge. And the last thing I'll say in 15 seconds is that another part, I mean, we also get into economy and other things. I won't get into that right now. But another important point is that we also have to be part of a struggle to democratize the entire region. You can't have a liberated, democratic Palestine, Israel in a region that's autocratic, that's poor, that's oppressive to its populations. So our struggle here has to be a regional struggle, you know, and we have to combine with progressive forces all through our region in order to make, I think, the Palestinian liberation struggle. I mean, I write in my books about a global Palestine. There's certainly here a regional Palestine and a global Palestine. So that, there's more to say, but I'll leave it at that. And you know, but again, we're beginning to give some substance now to the idea of what one state would look like and what the logic of it is.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for your remarks. We'll turn now to our last panelist, who is Conor McCarthy. Conor McCarthy teaches English at Maynooth University near Dublin, Ireland. He's the co-editor of Enforcing Silence, Academic Freedom, Palestine, and the Criticism of Israel, which was published in 2020. He's a founder member of the Ireland-Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and his remarks are going to address comparisons between the situation in Israel-Palestine and Ireland, North and South, insofar as discussion of reunification is becoming increasingly central to political discourse. Conor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lara. I hope I'm audible. I have a paper here. I hope I won't run over time. I'm going to suffer the misfortune of being belated vis-a-vis the other panelists who really have said much more than I can possibly say here. But I'll go ahead, and if anyone has any questions, that'll be fine. The first thing, of course, that I really should be doing is thanking Adib for his invitation to me to take part in this discussion. And the second thing that I must do is immediately admit to having a very severe case of imposter syndrome sitting on a panel with these astonishingly distinguished speakers. One thing I can do a little bit is to make some rather broad, rather crude comparisons with the Irish situation. And at the same time, I hope I can avoid a rather odious kind of Irish-splaining that seemed to start taking place after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. So I rely on you, Lara, and on my fellow panelists to kick me if I start to talk rubbish. Comparisons with Ireland and its relationship with Britain have been made by both Palestinians and Israelis. Zionist connections took many forms. Abraham Stern translated an early history of Sinn Féin into Hebrew, and Yitzhak Shamir took his nom de guerre from Michael Collins, the famous leader of the IRA. In 1938, Ze'ev Jabotinsky visited Dublin, met Eamon de Valera, the Irish Prime Minister of the time, and he sought Ireland's support for the Jewish state to come. And yet the connections were not all on the right of the political spectrum. It turns out that in 1937, in the context of the report of the Peel Commission, Judah Magnus, an early supporter of a one-state solution, wrote to de Valera to ask his opinion as to the effects of partition. We don't have Magnus's letter, but de Valera's reply survives. And de Valera wrote, "I do not know the Palestine problem as you know it, but from a knowledge of what partition means in Ireland now and what I'm convinced it will mean in the future, I have reached the same conclusion as you have. Namely, only by negotiation and free agreement between Jew and Arab can there be a satisfactory solution. I regard partition as perhaps the worst of the many solutions that have been proposed." In Ireland now, we've just passed the centenary of partition. Partition was effected by the Government of Ireland Act of 1920, which legislated for parliaments in Dublin and Belfast. In Northern Ireland, the Act came into force in early May 1921, and elections held later that month returned a unionist, that is a pro-UK majority. Meanwhile, the War of Independence, or the Black and Tan War, continued across the rest of the island. Partition produced considerable intercommunal violence in Northern Ireland, with 500 people killed in a couple of years and tens of thousands of refugees displaced, mostly Catholics moving south. The great Irish Marxist revolutionary James Connolly, who was executed for his part in the Easter Rising of 1916, predicted that partition of Ireland into nationalist and unionist states or statelets would produce what he called a carnival of reaction. He was not entirely wrong. Both of the policies that emerged from partition were deeply conservative, and both were tinged with ethno-religious chauvinism. James Craig, the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, famously referred to himself as leading or speaking to a Protestant parliament for a Protestant state. There's no doubt that the 6 counties that constitute Northern Ireland, even to this day, were at the time of partition the largest territory that a relatively stable Protestant majority could control. Equally, it has to be said that the early governments of the Free State explicitly had recourse to Roman Catholic doctrine in codifying various elements of policy touching on health and education and culture. In drawing up the 1937 Constitution, de Valera consulted the Roman Catholic hierarchy. The eventual document that he and his colleagues produced recognized various Christian denominations, and until 1973 recognized the special position of the Roman Catholic Church in Ireland. Interestingly, the 1937 Constitution also recognized what were called the Jewish congregations, and this won dev support amongst Irish Jews and resulted in the planting of the Eamon de Valera Memorial Forest near Nazareth in 1966. Dedicating the forest, Levi Eshkol declared that the Irish and the Jews have so much in common. In more recent times, as you all know, Irish sympathies have run much more in pro-Palestinian patterns. The collapse of the partition dispensation in Northern Ireland in the late 60s coincided with the emergence of modern Palestinian nationalism with the rise of Fatah and the Popular and Democratic fronts. Exchange of experience and techniques between Irish militants and Palestinian militants is well documented. The pro-Palestinian sympathies and angle of vision of Sinn Féin are also well known. And as Sinn Féin has achieved an impressive rise in electoral success in the Republic of Ireland in recent years, the question of Palestine has come onto the Irish political stage much more than would have been the case, say, 20 years ago. Edward Said was fascinated by Ireland and many admirers and allies here. Israeli diplomats, I'm reliably informed, regard a posting to Dublin as one not only of unhappy provinciality and obscurity, but one of great political and diplomatic difficulty as well. With the electoral success of Sinn Féin, both in Northern Ireland and in the Republic, the issue or the idea of reunification has increasingly appeared in political discussion. In the last general election in the Republic, Sinn Féin, now a kind of left populist party, secured 36 seats. That's 36 seats in a 166 seat national parliament. The same number as Fianna Fáil, which was for decades the largest party in the state. To exclude Sinn Féin from power, Fianna Fáil had to bury the hatchet with its old Civil War rival, Fine Gael, and form a coalition. To produce a governing majority, these two parties had to coalesce with the Greens. Every commentator expects Sinn Féin to do even better in the next election. It's no longer a question as to whether Sinn Féin will come to power in the south of Ireland, but when. In Northern Ireland, elections to the devolved assembly, which operates under the consociational terms of the Good Friday Agreement, recent elections were held just in the last couple of weeks. For the first time in the history of Northern Ireland, a nationalist party, Sinn Féin, has become the largest party in the polity, judged by seats won. And this should permit Sinn Féin to nominate a first minister, with the Democratic Unionist Party nominating a deputy first minister and an executive or government being formed. Sinn Féin's electoral success is very striking, although so also has been the success of the non-sectarian Alliance Party, which has come in from marginality to become a major player. Although Sinn Féin's chances to lead a Northern Ireland executive are on hold at the moment, it's still the party on the rise in Northern Ireland. A major element of its electoral platform has for some time been to call for what's called a border poll, or a referendum on unity. Provision for such referendums is part of the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. The Northern Ireland Secretary has to come to the conclusion that a majority within Northern Ireland would favour reunification. It's not completely clear just what kind of evidence of such sentiment is acceptable or would be deemed appropriate or definitive for that kind of recognition of a favouring of reunification. Up to 2017, most polling has revealed that only about 25% of Northern Irish people want reunification, with majorities preferring devolved government. Sentiment on reunification in the South is also quite hard to determine. A poll taken just last December showed that 62% of people would support unity, with only 16% opposed. But further stats seem to show that opinions are very soft and often confused. 42% said that they'd like to see a vote take place in the next 10 years. 52% agreed that a constitutional poll was not very important, but I would like to see it someday. 20% said it was very important and a priority for them. 24% said that such a poll was of no importance to them. Regarding flags and symbols, evidence of willingness to make change was weak. 77% declared that they would not change the national flag to recognize the unionist population, while 71% rejected Ireland rejoining the Commonwealth, which the Republic left in 1949, and 72% rejected changing the national anthem. Getting into some more meaty issues, which is not always easy to do given the dire level of public discussion about unity here, 79% of those polled said that they would not pay higher taxes to fund unification, while 79% also said that they would reject unification if it meant cutting spending on social services. Only a very slim majority said that they would back having unionist politicians in government in Dublin, 44% in favour against 42% against. Young voters are those most likely to vote in favour of a united Ireland at 67%. Interestingly, the next most enthusiastic age cohort is those aged over 65, of whom 66% support a united Ireland. Sinn Féin voters, unsurprisingly, are those most in favour of unity at 78%. So while there's quite a lot of talk of reunification in Ireland, particularly driven by Sinn Féin, unity nevertheless must be recognised as being a kind of vaguely held article of faith amongst almost all political parties in the South. But given this, it's much harder to get a sense of what work is being done or could be done to prepare for such an eventuality. And it's equally hard to get a sense, at least in public, as to what kind of political or legal or constitutional or economic or social thinking is going into what unification might actually be. My own worry is that public political discussion in Ireland is very lively at the level of day-to-day party politicking, but very impoverished at the level of principle or ideology, or what is sometimes called the vision thing. And this doesn't bode very well for the imagining of unification. Nations, and not only nations, but other kinds of polities are, as Benedict Anderson famously said, imagined communities. And a great deal of cultural and ideological work needs to be put into creating a new Irish nation or nationality, or indeed to create structures and institutions that could contain dual or bifurcated nationality. Now, I must also note there are fundamental differences between the Irish and the Palestinian situations, the Palestine situations. The most obvious of these is that if both situations arise from or out of colonial and imperial history, then we must realize that the colonial process is still underway in Palestine. Formidable forces, which people here can describe much better than me, are in continuing process in both the territories and inside Israel, pre-1967 Israel, which aggrandize land, water, homes, urban space, institutions, linguistic and cultural prestige to one ethnic or ethno-religious community, and which strip those necessities from another community. No such process is currently underway in Ireland, north or south, nor has it been for some time. So the Irish situation, while having deep colonial roots going back, in fact, to the middle 1500s, is not one of ongoing colonization, nor most of the time is the Irish situation now one characterized by continuing violence. The Irish situation is characterized by the presence of two established states, that is the Irish Republic and the United Kingdom. There is obviously no Palestinian state to speak of. Not even during the Oslo process was there any kind of nascent Palestinian state. The Good Friday Agreement, with all its problems, which are now being complicated further by Brexit, has had the benefit of bringing open intercommunal conflict or major conflict between armed militants and the British state to an end. And this means that any discussion of Irish unity now takes place in an atmosphere, if not of amity, then at least of relative calm. No such atmosphere appears to obtain in Israel-Palestine. The Irish peace process of the 1990s emerged from a particular confluence of forces and personalities. The governments of Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, and Bertie Ahern, for various reasons combining history, interest, ideology, and personality, were able to create structures which facilitated discussion between mainstream unionist and mainstream nationalist parties. In previous times, most obviously during the Thatcher years, the primacy of the American-UK alliance in the Second Cold War meant that no American government was going to balance Britain in settling what Britain regarded as an internal conflict by political as against anti-terrorist means. In other words, in comparison with the 1980s, the American impact on the Irish peace process of the 1990s was relatively positive. The American input in the roughly concurrent Oslo process was rather different. The Republic of Ireland was a small, economically significant state on the western fringe of Europe, but it was and is a state as such. It's a member of the richest trading bloc in the world, and the island of Ireland has been one of the more notable immigrant nurseries that fed into the growth and development of the expanding American Republic since the 1840s. In other words, there's a huge Irish-American constituency in the United States. Irish political power in the Democratic Party was, for a long time, quite real. And this meant that the United States acted in a much more balanced fashion in its intervention in Northern Ireland and in its peace process. For not dissimilar reasons, but cutting in the opposite direction, the American part in the roughly concurrent Oslo process was always going to be disastrously weighted towards the overwhelmingly stronger party to the conflict and to the neglect and detriment of the weaker party. Israel was and remains a small but very powerful state with the most dynamic economy in the Middle East, and it can boast exceptional lobbying power in the American political system, appealing to both the largest single diaspora Jewish community in the world and also to other American constituencies and interests. The external balancer in the Irish peace process was deeply unbalanced in the Israel-Palestine Oslo process. So I guess what I'm saying here, and it's kind of obvious, is that the balance of power, influence, and interest in any discussion of Irish unification is much more finely and fairly balanced than in any discussion of a one-state solution in Palestine. Not only that, but major conflict is not continuously underway in Ireland. The problems that Britain makes with its Brexit project in Northern Ireland, enough as they are to stymie all sorts of moves within the European Union, are as nothing to Israel's seemingly ineluctable drive to go on creating late colonial complications for itself and for the Palestinians. What this means is that while the imagining of unification in Ireland is at present weak, and this means conducting a border poll quite possibly a risky or improbable exercise, the imagination of a single secular democratic state in Palestine, or a binational state, or some federated or power-sharing arrangement in Israel-Palestine seems, at least to me, to be a much greater and more tricky task. A number of problems seem to occur to me. Firstly, while the binational state may be part of the intellectual heritage of the Yishuv, the task of re-injecting it into the mainstream of Israeli politics will be considerable. While the idea of the single secular democratic state was part of Palestinian political thinking in the 60s and the 70s, the task of re-mainstreaming it, again, may be considerable. In other words, inherited political institutions and their legitimating ideas will have to be modified, revamped, set aside, critiqued. The existing political institutions, both Israeli and Palestinian, will need enormous change or replacement. Powerful interests will resist any such change. One then asks, just how will such processes of reinvention take place? Will they need outside intervention, supervision, aid, resources? In a society where many kinds of power, material wealth, land, culture, education, social services, health, are currently vested so heavily with one community, one wonders by what possible means this uneven division can be adjusted and rectified. And of course, there's also the question as to what an interested outsider like me at the individual level, or like other countries at the level of states, can do to assist in this process. Outside agencies, after all, don't necessarily have a great history in Palestine. The UN voted for partition, but was unable to prevent the Nakba. Israel arguably takes its founding legitimacy in international law from Resolution 181, but has shown scant regard for UN directives ever since. The EU is an economic giant, but a foreign policy midget, and its approach to Israel is marked by Holocaust guilt and deference to the United States. Groups like the Quartet have long been dominated by the United States. In the Irish case, various kinds of assistance or advice or guidance were availed of. Economic aid from the United States and from Europe, the supervision of the decommissioning of the arms of non-state actors, guidance in rebalancing the sectarian character of the police force, the creation of new or altered institutions in many elements of the state, the funding of manifold new or different civil society institutions, the concept of parity of esteem to be given to various cultural traditions. Intense work has been put into many kinds of symbolic action and ritual, visits of heads of state, many kinds of historical commemoration and acknowledgement, cultural exchange. Can we hope for such possibilities in Palestine? Edward Said famously wrote about the need back in the 1980s for Palestinians to attain permission to narrate. He wrote, of course, at a time when a triumphant Zionist narrative could successfully interdict any effort to give narrative expression to the Palestinian experience. But he also wrote just a few years later about how the experience of empire gave rise to what he called overlapping territories and intertwined histories between the metropolis and the periphery, between the colonizer and the colonized. That is, at the cultural level, an epiphenomenon as it might be, a shared culture and history will have to be constructed and recognized. But in the words of Nancy Fraser and Axel Honneth, recognition must be accompanied by redistribution. Both must take place for a one-state solution to take hold. Thank you. Thanks, Lara.
Thank you very much. So we will get into the Q&A discussion part of the panel today. There have been some questions coming in as the panelists have been speaking. And if you do still have a question, now is the time to drop it into the Q&A box. And I want to start with a question I have. And I guess that's the benefit of being the moderator. I can put my question first, and then I'll get to the others. Speaking about the right of return, I'm a Palestinian, daughter of refugees, granddaughter of refugees, and although I live outside of Palestine today, it would be my great honor and desire to exercise my Palestinian right of return one day. So, and this can go to any of the panelists. How do you concretely envisage Palestinians going back to Palestine? Where would we live? My family is originally from Gaza and Jaffa, and I was speaking with my grandmother the other day on the phone, and I said, you know, our situation's a bit different because we weren't expelled during the Nakba. We're actually originally from Gaza, so we didn't actually lose our homes through expulsion. However, we lost a lot of land because Gaza, as it was before, was much bigger than the Gaza that we know now. So the land that I could potentially have to live on right now is part of Israel, right? So would I get my land back? How? If you have any details about this and how this could be carried out, and specifically like in terms of documentation. I mean, I know Israel has records on my family. I know this because they interrogated me when I arrived in Tel Aviv airport, and they showed me pictures of Palestinians and asked me to identify them, and they had a photo of my grandfather. I know this because they asked me to draw a family tree so that they could collect more and more data. So I know they know what land was my family's, and is that going to be taken into consideration when Palestinians are physically, concretely exercising their right of return? Question is open.
Yeah, if I may. First of all, yes, Palestinians do have the right of return. I mean, if Jews can claim a right of return after 2,000 years, surely we can claim the right of return after a couple of generations. It's moral, legal, ethical, political, in every way, it is a requirement. Now, if the land that you have lost now has a multi-story building that was built on it by somebody else, well, obviously you have to get either compensation or alternative land from somewhere else. And in terms of absorption, I mean, Israel created a whole department for absorption of millions of Jewish refugees who had absolutely nothing in Palestine. Provided them with housing, provided them with training, provided them with job opportunities. So yes, there will have to be a department that would take care of that type of restitutive justice. But I want to, at the same time, reassure my Zionist Jewish friends that while every Palestinian will demand the right of return, not every Palestinian will exercise that right. Many of them have lived somewhere else and have their roots and have their children in schools and have their businesses, but that is their right to return to their homeland. Right now, they can't even go to visit. Sometimes even with a foreign passport, they get stopped, they get questioned, they get turned back at the bridges or at the airport. So the right of return is an essential right for the Palestinians, and it can be, in fact, addressed in a very meaningful way. And it doesn't have to be the catastrophe that the Zionists proclaim that it is.
Does anybody else want to add anything to this question? Jeff, I think you're muted.
Jeff,
oh, you're muted still.
Okay. Two things very quickly. One is, you know, Salman Abu Sita, the well-known Palestinian geographer, in his studies has found that 85% of the land that was taken from the Palestinians in 1948 is still available. In other words, it wasn't built upon. Israeli, the Israeli state has built upon pretty much already existing urban areas that were existing before 48. I mean, they took Palestinian towns and cities and Judaized them, but but they didn't take the land. The land was actually either given to kibbutzim or more, Israeli agricultural settlements, or were kind of buried under national parks and so on. So Abu Sita's point is that, in fact, I mean, Palestinian refugees might not come back to their homes. I mean, because Israel obviously systematically demolished more than 530 entire Palestinian villages, towns, and urban areas on purpose, so that they couldn't return. But they could certainly return to the region that they're from. And in fact, with Zochrot, there's a whole group of Palestinian planners and architects that have developed all kinds of plans for modern, not only Palestinian, I think they should be integrated, because you don't want to build ghettos either, but modern communities with infrastructure, because you don't want the refugees are coming back as a traumatized, in many cases undereducated, underskilled population. So return, I think this is also part of our plan, by the way. We're talking not only about return, but how do you reintegrate that population? In other words, how do they come from camps in Syria and Lebanon and reintegrate into a modern society? So it isn't only going back to your house. It's, are you going back to a community that has an infrastructure, that has employment, that has educational facilities? So that's one plan that's being developed, actually, is reconstructing on Palestinian land in the region where you're from, a new community that is a mixture of where you came from and your own home, but a newer home with infrastructure. The second thing I want to say very, very quickly is that we have to talk about it. We haven't filled out all the details, obviously, but the whole issue of the land regime is really important. And there are parts of Israel and Zionism that shouldn't be discarded, maybe would be useful. You don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. In Israel, you've got a very good land regime system. In other words, the land belongs to the state. It doesn't belong to individuals. You don't have private ownership. You do have, to some degree, in Palestinian communities, because they were in existence before 48. But for the most part, and most of the lands were taken anyway, 96% of the land of Israel is called state land. And that's a very good system from the point of view that if you want to do rational urban planning, agricultural planning, environmental protection, and so on, give affordable housing to people, that's a good regime. What's bad about it, in the apartheid sense, of course, is it's only open to Israeli Jews. I mean, that part, obviously, it has to be eliminated. But one question in the new state is, maybe that land regime idea should be adopted, and then families like yours that have lost land would either get compensated with land, or they would get compensated financially or whatever. But I think the idea of a land regime of state lands, rather than going back to private ownership, and now with capitalism, that would I think be a terrible system. There are models that we could adopt. But like I said, because we haven't been dealing with political solutions in all our discussions, we've never gotten to those kinds of issues. And those are exactly the issues that we have to sit down collectively with and really work out.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So one of our viewers today would like to know, having read both Jonathan and Jeff's books, Jeff seems to think there's a substantial difference, but is there really one? Doesn't Jonathan replace an apartheid state with equal citizenship and one parliament? Where is the real difference? And that could go to either of you, actually.
Well,
Awad, who's a neutral. Jonathan, go ahead.
I think one big difference is that I don't spend a lot of time analyzing the ideology and the settler colonialism and the international law and the human rights violations. I try to go with what is now and how it can and how we can accommodate both sides. I expected that Palestinians would be much more upset with me, that I was more accommodationist than I needed to be. But you heard Jeff, he was very strong on the political program and the political analysis that should go before a political movement. I think that's one big difference between us. But yes, we are very similar in terms of the outcomes that we both hope to achieve.
Well, if I can say one thing, Awad, do you want to jump in?
You'll have to unmute.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, why it is, first of all, I would like just to add one sentence about the right of return. And besides what Jeff said, you know, we often in the ODRC relate to the survey that was conducted by Salman Abu Sitta, which is very important. But what I wanted to say is that there is no legitimacy for the one democratic state solution without the return of the refugees. There is no legitimacy. I don't think that this state is going to be legitimate if we ignore the right of the refugees, because the problem started with the refugees. And this, of course, the return of the refugees will be decided upon, through mass struggle, which will force Israel to recognize the right of return. So, and another thing related to this is that the refugees are the Palestinians who were living in Israel proper, or in Palestine, which became Israel proper. And I can say that the refugees who are in the refugee camps are me, because my relation to the refugees is not only national. I mean, it's not only I belong to the refugees or belong to me because we belong to the Palestinian people, but also they are my family, because every family inside the Green Line, including me, for example, I have a lot of relatives from my village who were forced to flee the village in 1948, and at least 3 of my aunts were killed in 1982 during the Israeli invasion. My aunt came in 1992, 80-year-old, looking for the body of one of her sons who was killed by the Israelis. And she was refused to stay here, though her house is still, existing. So this is just to clarify for the foreign audience that who are the refugees. So the refugees were, as Jeff said, were the citizens of this Palestine. They are still, they're part of us. So this one thing. The second thing relating to the difference between the analysis of Jeff and Jonathan, I must say that the analysis of the roots of the struggle is very necessary, because when the PLO abandoned the anti-colonial struggles, in fact, they abandoned the roots of the conflict that goes back to 1948, not in 1967. Because Oslo, what Oslo did is that it, in fact, submerged the knowledge or the consciousness of large sections or segments of Palestinian people, that the struggle goes to 1948. And myself, I was a victim, the first victim of the Nakba, because the Israeli occupied first us before they occupied the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So in order to return the knowledge of the roots of the conflict and to mobilize the Palestinian young generation we have to go back to 1948. This reunites the Palestinian people. This is very essential that the young generation, some of whom forgot or were even denied the right to know, especially in the West Bank and Gaza Strip until recently, I mean, because I'm not speaking about the current situation when the young generation is leading the mass mobilizations. I'm telling how a few years ago, really, when I used to speak to Israel, to the Palestinian university in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, when they ignored or they didn't know who are the Palestinians in Israel, when they thought that Palestine is reduced to West Bank and Gaza Strip only. So, I mean, this is very important, I mean, to give a analysis or a redefinition of Israel as a settler colonial state. Because when you say this, the solution that would come out of this analysis is one state in all of Palestine. And the very recent mobilizations or the uprisings, I mean, has proved that the Palestinian young generation is retaining the idea of Palestine as one demography and one geography. Thanks.
Can I say one thing quickly? Or
Last thing, and then we'll go to another question.
okay, but very quickly in terms of the difference between me and Jonathan's idea. I mean, you know, they're very similar in ways, but there's one very nuanced but very important difference. Again, and I mentioned that Jonathan is basing his plan on two national groups within one state, you know, getting along with each other in a sense. In other words, the whole idea that, you know, the Minister of Defense will be Israeli, the Minister of Police will be Palestinian and so on. And as, you know, the problem is that, you know, national groups do not get along with each other. And in fact, it's inherent in national groups, nationalistic groups, especially one that has gone through an anti-colonial struggle, that they both want sovereignty. They're both pushing. They're rivals both to each other, and they're also rivals to the state that's trying to bring order to the whole thing. And so, you know, in my view, Jonathan's plan strengthens that nationalist tendency of both groups rather than subordinating it. And in my view of our plan, you know, we have to create a strong civil state with strong civil institutions. The guarantee of each national group to its integrity comes in the Constitution. That's in the Constitution. You build civil institutions in which you know, your police and army are manned by the best people, but the principle is they're citizens. Not that they're Israelis and that they're Palestinians. You don't want to perpetuate and strengthen that. So that's the big difference. We're putting the emphasis on a common citizenship, on a common civil identity that controls and constrains those nationalist impulses that are really our enemies in a way. So we have to respect them and let them express themselves, but we can't give them that space to take over the common civil space that's essential if we really want to build something together, a shared life together.
Thank you. That's very clear. The next question comes from one of our viewers, Bassam, and he would like to know, how do we psychologically get both sides to work together as co-citizens towards common civic goals, considering the oppressor-oppressed history that persisted for generations? Would a Truth and Reconciliation Commission like South Africa help here? And if not, I'll add, what else can we do? And let's think outside the box on this one.
Yeah, I think a Truth and the Reconciliation Commission can work, but you see, that only comes after the struggle is over, to heal the wounds. I will surprise people by telling them that there are already islands which give you glimpses of the kind of human interaction that is possible, even under these very oppressive conditions, if you just begin to see a little bit of the humanity of the others. I remember there was an incident where a car of settlers, armed settlers, actually had an accident on the Hebron Jerusalem road, one of the few roads where Jews and Arabs still travel. And the car fell down into the ravine, and immediately people from Hebron stopped and went down to help them out. They didn't even think twice, because the common humanity is the more natural human response. In hospitals, you see the same. Inside the hospital, there could be fighting and shooting and everything else outside. Inside the hospital, you see a little Jewish baby and a little Palestinian baby, and their mothers can really relate to one another, almost as if there is no conflict. The conflict is the oppressive situation that forces itself on them, that forces a separation, number one, and number two, oppression, with one group having certain rights over another. But I think that the basic humanity of both groups can be tapped, and can be tapped very quickly once you remove the institutional privileges and the institutional structures that serve one people at the expense of another. I think you will find that the question is not, I get in these discussions where, oh, you need a long time to build the trust. This is not a question of building trust. It's a question of having institutions and procedures in place that provide for equality, that remove the apartheid system of privileging one group at the expense of another. And I think you will find that there is a human interaction can resume very quickly. It will surprise you how quickly it can come back.
Conor, I wonder if there's anything that we can learn from the Irish example here in terms of coming together and reconciliation. If there's anything you'd like to say, otherwise we can go to another question.
I
don't know as much that I can. Sorry, Lara. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. What did you say?
I wasn't sure if you were addressing me. No, the thing I did want to say, and I don't want to waste time going back to the previous question too much. But when Jeff was making the point that there is the risk of not having some kind of supervening civic, secular us or created community, I think that's actually one of the problems that has happened in Northern Ireland with the Good Friday Agreement. If in what I was saying in my talk, I seem to be saying very positive things about the Good Friday Agreement, those positive things really stem from the fact that the immediacy of violent conflict has been put, at least for the moment, to bed in Northern Ireland. But what the Good Friday Agreement as a consociational agreement has done is it has sort of reified or institutionalized certain kinds of sectarian difference. So in fact, as it happens, since the Good Friday Agreement, which was negotiated 24 years ago in Northern Ireland, the actual geographic demography of Northern Ireland is actually more separate, more polarized than it was during the conflict. That is the existence, for instance, of Catholics and Protestants living side by side. That has decreased under the terms of the peace, right? There has been no attempt to desegregate schooling. And one of the reasons that after these elections that have just taken place in the last couple of weeks, that the situation in Northern Ireland is now currently frozen, is because only the agreement as it was set up, or actually an outrider of the Good Friday Agreement called the St. Andrews Agreement, which is negotiated in Scotland, that stipulates that only Sinn Féin or the Democratic Unionist Party, the largest nationalist and the largest unionist party, only they can nominate first ministers. So the rise of the Alliance Party that I mentioned in my talk, a new or relatively newly prominent non-sectarian party, they can't make any contribution to the nomination of a chief minister at all under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. but precisely because the Good Friday Agreement does not address the kinds of points that Jeff was making at the end of his last contribution. So I'll stop there.
Okay, the next question goes to the educational system in this new one state. We know that Jewish Israeli children are ingrained very early on with this notion of militarism and Jewish supremacy. I remember when I was in Palestine in 2010, we saw a field trip, I guess it was, being accompanied of young kids being accompanied by soldiers. And one of my Israeli American friends told me that one of the first plays that they did when she was a young child in Israel was a reenactment of 1948. And so in this new one state, how would the Department of Education look? I mean, what are Palestinian children going to be learning about the history? What are Jewish Israeli children going to be learning about the history? Do we need to write our history together? Anyone can answer.
Well, I'll say something about that, and that is that I think the idea is, and I'll relate it back to this idea of how do you get in South Africa you had a transition. That's what it was called. In other words, it wasn't what South Africa did, and this is what this I think is part of what the One Democratic State campaign is trying to do, and what Jonathan is trying to do, but we're not focused enough on it. We're not doing it enough yet. And that is building. What South Africa did was build civil institutions before the end of apartheid. They had a constitution, a draft constitution, before apartheid ended. They began to talk about already in the 50s about what the educational system would be about. In other words, this question of the education is important, but you can't, just as Jonathan says, you can't do healing after, before liberation. On the contrary, you can't design educational systems or civil institutions after the state has been declared or after liberation. This has to happen beforehand. And you have to, so that when you do the transition, then these institutions are in place. And I think there's enough Palestinians and enough critical Israelis, and there has been work on this actually, developing shared narratives, developing educational materials to give expression. I don't like the word both sides. That's a fake symmetry for me. And I don't think we should artificially try to integrate colonial narratives with indigenous narratives. I don't think that works either. So how we approach this, but in other words, we have to begin to recruit people, like Awad says, academics and thinkers and people in the ground, teachers and so on now, and set up a commission right today in 2022 to design an educational curriculum. To design we should begin designing all the civil institutions, I think, already. Okay, I'll leave it at that. I have something else to say, but I'll say it at the end of this state. That's okay.
Yeah.
Period.
I want to tell you an anecdote. During the heady days when people thought that we were about to have a state, when there were negotiations taking place between Israelis and Palestinians, I was a member of the Palestinian negotiating team, I have to admit. And at one time, the Israelis wanted to raise the issue of what they call incitement in Palestinian textbooks, which is one of their favorite games. Yes. So he said, we have to have, as we were thinking of transferring educational authority to the Palestinian Authority, we need to have something about peace and incitement. I said, that is wonderful. I said, we really need to teach a new generation about peace rather than violence. So why don't we have a joint committee to look at your books and our books and see those elements that are for that promote violence and that promote weapons and that promote military training and your high school programs that prepare people for the army. We don't need that. We are moving into an era of peace. I say, stop right there. You teach them what you want. We'll teach them what you want. Thank you very much. He cut it right away. Because obviously, yes, the Israeli system has been training its children in a way that's built on violence and built on war and built on security and built on military training. And yes, I would love joint programs that teach our children about peace and about reconciliation, about understanding each other's history and each other's culture. That's why I said 10% of the budget of the defense department for the new state should go to teach peace and reconciliation and understanding and coexistence.
Awad, are you trying to say something?
Awad.
Yeah, I just want to refer to the teaching curricula that is imposed on Palestinian schools in Israel. You know, this is the most difficult thing to do. I mean, how to imagine a shared education system. Even me as a Palestinian, as a citizen of the state of Israel, I mean, I'm not allowed to learn the history of my people.
Mm-hmm.
And the teaching curricula still ignore the Palestinian narrative at all. And I was one of the teachers who was fired in 1980 twice from 2 schools simply because I dared to challenge the teaching curricula that is imposed on the schools. And I remember I was teaching the piece by James Baldwin about this, my dungeon shook, I don't know if you know it, in which compares between the lights and blacks in the United States. And you know, the piece was inserted in inserted in the teaching curriculum, not in order to compare between the relationship between Palestinians and Jews in Israel, but between blacks and whites. So when you dare to compare that with the Palestinians, you would get fired. I mean, you are not allowed to say orally anything. And when 75 years have passed, and we are still struggling to change, even a slight change has not happened. And the other opposite, we were taught the Torah, about other things, and we were learning by heart. We were forced to learn by heart even verses from the Torah, while we are denied the right to learn about the history, and still going on until today. So this is Israel democracy. So, I mean, I can't imagine how can we do that. I think that, and going back to the question that Bassam maybe asked, how can we achieve the one-state solution? How can we make a change, a radical change? I mean, this is not going to take place by persuasion. This is not going to take place by diplomacy. This is going to happen through resistance, because the majority, the overwhelming of the majority of the Israelis are totally against any right of the Palestinian people. And, you know, we shouldn't wait until the Israelis will be convinced of this idea, because South Africans, the white South Africans, were no less racist at the eve of the crumbling of the apartheid regime. And this was confirmed to me by Wolf Meyer, the former police minister, who became a member of the ANC after the collapse of the apartheid regime. So, I mean, first of all, we have to present the world with an ethical discourse, with an ethical platform, that we want a state, we want an egalitarian state. This would capture the imagination of the world and the freedom fighters. Third. Second, we have to devise a political strategy, how to reunite the Palestinian people, because the major agent of a change is the Palestinian people, not the Israelis, because the Israelis are happy with their life. The Palestinians who have to lead the struggle in order to force the Israelis to come to negotiations and negotiate the end of apartheid and settler colonialism. So political platform, political strategy, and popular struggle inside Palestine and boycott outside. I mean, global struggle. So this is the strategy that has to be endorsed and articulated. And this is the major challenge before all those who advocate for one-state solution.
I'm also told that to any of our viewers who would like to have more information about the 10-point program or about Jonathan's book or about more of the work of the panelists generally, that the organization will be sending out an email containing links and information in this regard. So with all of that said, I'm going to have to turn the floor back over to Adib, who's going to close us out and provide us with some helpful information for tomorrow's panel.
Can we ask a question or a request?
Adib is now in charge. So.
Can we get the paper of Conor? I mean, or more, even have more stuff about, because it's very informative for me. In fact, I would be grateful if I can get a copy of his paper and other things. I mean,
if he's happy to share, we're happy to facilitate.
Absolutely.
I'd be more than happy to share my rather pathetic document with you, Awad. I'd be honored. I'd be very honored. Thank you.
If you have additional stuff too.
We'll be glad to facilitate and make sure that you get it, Awad.
Thank you.
First of all, we want to apologize to the attendees for the technical issues that we've had with closed captioning, but it will be available with the recordings. It was just a glitch. And also, I want to thank Lara for moderating, and thanks out to our great panelists. It was inspiring and thought-provoking, and we look forward to take to heart what you guys said and to work together on the future for Palestine and to end the colonial settler exclusivist regime, apartheid regime for all of its citizens. Also, I want to take this opportunity to thank our co-sponsors once more and by name. It's the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, American Friends Services Committee, Appalachian Peace Education Center, Arab American Association of Central Virginia, Episcopal Peace Fellowship, National Capital Regional Chapter, Friends of Sabeel, North America, Jewish Voice for Peace, DC Metro, National Arab American Women's Association, Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace, Virginia Coalition for Human Rights, Voices from the Holy Land. We thank you, and we will have the recording available to you to share with your members and on social media. Also, we look forward for our panel tomorrow that will explore together with all of our attendees and our panelists, how do we get from here to there? Please join us tomorrow, and you could use the same link that you were provided. You will get a reminder email. And again, thank you on behalf of the organizing committee, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow in the Shireen Abu Akleh New Path to Peace conference. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adib. Lara, thank you.
Thank you.